Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you. Last week, we were in Washington, D.C. at an event that I've gone to for about the last 15 years called Feet to the Fire. It's to draw attention to the problem of people who come to America illegally. But I mentioned on the first day of our broadcast from Capitol Hill that that very day, about 1,000 people in my hometown had actually stood up and took the oath of citizenship. Now, it's not necessarily easy to do this. To enter the United States, you go to the local consulate in the country you live in at that time. If you're going to do it the legal way, you say, I'd like to get a green card. I'd like to emigrate to America. The average wait time is 6 to 7 years. And then once you come to America, you have to be self-sufficient, and then you have to study. And if you stay for 5 years and you don't get in trouble with the law, after 5 years, you can take a test. You have to be ready for that. And you can become an American citizen if you choose to. Well, a lot of people ask when I talk about those new citizens taking the oath of citizenship, they say, how many American kids do you suppose could actually take that test and pass it? Well, Nicholas Giordano is a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College and the host of the Pass Report podcast. He's also a fellow at Campus Reform's Higher Education Fellowship. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lars, for having me on.
How do you suppose that the average American high school graduate would do if they were to take the citizenship test? They're not required to, but if they took it, how do you suppose they'd do?
Well, I'm sad to report, I wrote a piece for the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform reflecting that most Americans would not be citizens today if their citizenship depended on taking this exam. I've been giving it for every semester for the last 12 years, and the overwhelming majority of students fail the exam.
Ouch. Now, is there a reason that those students who come to you, presumably prepared from going to public school, meant some of your kids may have actually come to you from a private school, why are they so woefully underprepared?
Well, it's largely because the K through 12 institutions have fundamentally collapsed. They've decided to move away from actual civics and American government, focus more on how to train activists for the next generation. This has had a detrimental impact, and what I argue is that if people in America don't know the country, the basic foundations, why the government was set up the way it was, and who's responsible for what in government, how can a country possibly survive when we're just a bunch of strangers living amongst each other?
I'll try a radical idea on you, but Professor, do you think perhaps we should say to kids, if you go to high school, we want you to take the citizenship test at the end of high school, or maybe in the last year you're in high school, and we expect you to pass it to get that graduation diploma. Do you think if they actually prepared for it, they could pass the test?
I do, and I think that it's necessary. Some states have moved in this direction. I believe Iowa has. I believe Florida is moving in that direction. But I think more states need to do that. I think that we do need a requirement that they can pass a basic citizenship test. And let's face it, if you look up the citizenship exam, it's really not that hard as long as students are learning about America and our foundation. Unfortunately, most students today can't even differentiate between the Russian Constitution and the American Constitution.
You know, it's funny, I got an email last week when I was talking about this from a teacher who I think was a bit defensive because she said, look, I'm a conservative, I teach civics, and we do teach about the Constitution. And I wrote back to her, I don't have time to write back to everybody, but I wrote back to her, and I said, well, let me ask you a basic question. Do you teach the kids in your classes where their rights come from? Now, see, for anybody like me, you'd say, well, that's easy. You get them by being born and from God. You know, you don't get them from the government. In fact, we run a soundbite of JFK talking about the extraordinary idea that the people's rights come from God and not from government. And what I got back from her was not exactly the best response. She said, well, you know, we do talk about where their rights come from. And I said, well, if you're not telling them they come from God, then where do those rights come from? Because the only other alternative, I would think, is that you get your rights from the government. Well, if the government gives you your rights, then the government can take your rights away. But the founders of this country believed that your rights were inalienable, that they came because you were born a human being, and they don't come from the government. Many other countries have a different view of it.
And you bring up a great point, because I think if we look, every issue seems to be becoming federalized today. Every time something goes wrong or there's a problem, there's this knee-jerk reaction to look to government to solve the problem. So I think that speaks to the heart of what you're saying. And when we look at the K through 12 institutions, teaching a half semester of government or a year of government, American government, isn't going to cut it. They should be learning about American government each and every year to reinforce. They should have the Declaration of Independence nearly memorized by the time they get to me. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And it's having a detrimental impact on our society.
Yeah, and in fact, I get people who write to me all the time and ask me questions, and I'm stunned at sort of the lack of basic understanding of how things work. How did that become a law? And they say, did the courts do that? And I said, well, occasionally the courts write law, but that's my political point of view. But the Congress or your state legislature is supposed to do it, and there's supposed to be a certain number of enumerated powers that the federal government has, and the federal government is supposed to keep its hands off everything else. Except, as you point out, almost everything becomes federalized at some point, whether the Constitution allows that or not.
Well, look at the last 3 years. I mean, perhaps if more people had a better understanding about the role of government, but more importantly, the role of the people, maybe we wouldn't have seen all these unconstitutional decrees. Maybe we wouldn't have seen so many people that just blindly obeyed everything they were being told, from lockdowns to masking to school closures. It's completely ridiculous. And in order to reverse the trend, I mean, government impacts every aspect of our life, from gas prices to food prices to what career fields we want to go in, and licensing and buying a home. And yet we don't require government being taught each and every year. Instead, we'll require a focus on the STEM programs, where a lot of students are never going to need to know that material once they graduate the high schools.
You know, it's funny, Nicholas, I may be a bit older than you, but I remember in high school when one of the requirements for us was there's a computer language called BASIC that it basically nobody uses. I don't even think the professional programmers used it then. And they said one of your core competencies has to be able to write a program in the basic computer language. And even at the time, those of us who were kind of entranced by technology said, well, none of this is going to be any use because we're not actually going to be writing the programs for the most part. They said, doesn't matter. Somebody at the legislature decided it was one of your core competencies, so learn how to do it. And I could still write a basic program in basic language today, and it has absolutely no application to my life whatsoever. The programs I use are all programs written by professional programmers. And yet that was one of the things they decided I had to learn how to do. What I wasn't given was a good, solid understanding of the Constitution. I had to get that on my own.
And that's the problem. So I teach political science for a reason. I'm not the greatest in math, and I struggled through binomials and trinomials. And yet I passed it. To this day, I've never encountered a math problem of a binomial and trinomial in my life, yet I encounter government each and every day. And so which one was more important?
No, it's funny because, in fact, I do like science fiction, and there was a movie some years ago where one of the astronauts actually says, yes, this is that moment, and his colleagues say, what? He says, that moment they told you about in school when they said algebra will save your life. And it happened that they were in a situation where algebra would save their life, but doesn't happen to most of us and isn't likely to happen either. Would you mind telling folks where they can find out more about the Campus Reform organization and where to find information?
Absolutely. So they could go to type in Campus Reform on a search engine, Nicholas Giordano, and I'll pop up. Go to campusreform.com. Also, you can visit the PAS Report website and have links up to Campus Reform from there as well.
Professor, it's really a pleasure. That's Professor Nicholas Giordano, a professor of political science at Suffolk Community College.